Hi people, Happy New Year. So hope you all had a good one. For me, it was relatively quiet because I had a bad migraine for some reason. But I do like New Year's. I do like seeing it in. And it was a bit different this year. Me and my family actually watched the New Year chime down on our vintage Victorian clock. Dates back to 1860. With a few adaptations, it's been chiming pretty much consistently. So it was a bit different to see it in that way. We're at the quarter century point, so it is quite a mark in time. I may or may not make a video specifically about that, but anyway, just 75 more years to go to 2100, so quarter century. Okay, so straight to the point here. I I've been thinking about Oleksandr Usyk and his place in the sport of boxing. I did watch the second Usyk Fury fight. It was uploaded pretty quickly by Turkey Alakşik. Now, there's a lot that has been said about Saudi Arabia's dominance in the sport of boxing these days, particularly the heavyweight division. But I'll give credit where credit's due. Turkey Alakşik is a very good promoter, and I don't have pay-per-view, so I'm not going to complain if I get a high quality fight uploaded to YouTube days after the event. It used to be that I'd have to wait sometimes even years after the event to get that. In this case, it's uploaded days afterwards, so credit where credit's due. I'm very briefly on that point about Saudi Arabia's role in the sport. I do have some concerns. I think that Saudi Arabia is not a traditional boxing country. Modern sport developed in Britain in around the 1680s onwards, and of course has been largely dominated, at least in the heavyweight division, by Britain and America. Been a few Canadians, a few Germans, and in the 21st century, Ukraine's been very dominant. But yeah, it's fair to say that there isn't really an Arab basis to boxing. So for a country that doesn't have that history to come in and there's big, big money involved, there is valid questions about what are the vested interests here. I knew some people were a little bit uneasy when the Saudi national anthem was sung in the all British heavyweight fight between Joshua and Dubois at Wembley. I'll say one thing about that though: 96,000 people in attendance. I think it's absurd for people to say that boxing is dead. How can you say boxing is dead when you get fight attendances like that? It's just a contradiction. Boxing's not dead. Boxing has question marks, but it's not dead. Um, but yeah, for Saudi Arabia's role, a bit like Beijing getting the Olympic Games are human rights issues. Saudi Arabia doesn't have the standards of the West. There's no secret about that. Having said that, I genuinely believe that has gradually improved in recent years. I genuinely think if we look at Saudi Arabia today compared to 10 years ago, it is marginally better. And I say marginally, I say that with no flippancy at all. I like the sport of boxing, but I am passionate about human rights as well. And I make no apology for that. Most boxing fans, oh, leave politics out of it, blah, blah, blah. No, I make no apology. This is my channel. I'm interested in boxing. I'm interested in human rights. So I will speak about both. Um, but, there could be an argument that by more focus on the kingdom, more exposure, it actually presses through change. Now, that didn't happen in China. China's human rights situation, if anything, has got worse. So getting the Olympics didn't, reform China in that sense. But Saudi Arabia, women have marginally more rights than they did 10 years ago. It's very marginal. This is still a country where atheists are treated like terrorists. So I'd be very, very cautious. But there are reformers in Saudi Arabia who are starting to get a little bit of political sway. And something I noticed, again, others might not think much about this, but there's women ringside for these big heavyweight fights. Now, to be fair, they're mostly the girlfriends and, foreign fans of those fighters. If we start seeing Saudi women in the audience, that might be a sign that things really are changing. It's a bit like in Iran, women going to football matches, um, kind of to defy the morality police. So there's little indicators like that that might be a sign that things are changing. In which case, it may not be so sinister after all. But I do think for one, for any sport to be dominated by one little group of people isn't necessarily a good thing. Um, it's a bit like in football when, clubs are taken over by wealthy Americans. In the case of boxing, wealthy Saudis. I don't know. I mean, people might argue that Turkey Alex Sheik is saving the sport by staging these huge events, but why can't a British promoter like Eddie Hearn also put on those big events? Like, I don't know. I haven't followed boxing politics closely recently, but Britain has some great venues. We've got Wembley. I don't see any reason why an all British heavyweight clash like Dubois versus Joshua can't be promoted by Brits, can't be a British event. I do wonder about that. I've nothing against, by the way, boxing going around the world because, I mean, one thing that was good about Ali's era was you had fights everywhere. You had, like, for example, Rumble in the Jungle in Kinshasa. You had Thrilla in Manila in the Philippines. A lot of that you have to give Don King credit for. So I've no problem with boxing being international. It would be a bit boring if all fights were in London and Las Vegas. Um, but you know, that's not the case. So I've no problem with it going around the world, but I just think that if it was always, I mean, there isn't a huge interest from what I gather in the Arab world for boxing. So most of the fans tend to be outsiders. So I don't know if the sort of dominance of Saudi millionaires in the sport will get more of an Arab interest in the sport, which could be lucrative. I don't know. I mean, is the prowess of Jile Zhong, the Chinese heavyweight, is that garnering more Chinese fans? I don't think it necessarily is. When I speak to the Chinese I know, they haven't heard of the guy, even though he's, certainly one of the most dominant heavyweights at the moment. Um, so I don't know. Anyway, moving on to Usyk. Fight was good. I wouldn't say it was an exceptional fight in terms of action. It was a good fight. I wouldn't say, for example, it had the action of the Fury Wilder trilogy or the Lewis Klitschko fight, which to me is one of the best heavyweight fights ever. But it was good. It was a good fight. Um, CompuBox shows that Usyk won it. I mean, Fury's running his mouth, but this is just the problem with Tyson Fury. And I just I can't talk about Usyk without talking about Fury. Part of me is proud of the fact that a British guy has been the dominant heavyweight. Two British guys, Joshua and Fury, have been the dominant heavyweights for the last 5 years. But um, certainly the most dominating Brit since Lennox Lewis. But Fury runs his mouth, I think a lot of people think Joshua isn't what he once was, and Fury just keeps running his mouth. John Fury's an embarrassment. He should be dropped from the entourage. His antics are just embarrassing. And, assaulting one of Usyk's entourage, that's common assault. These are supposed to be professional sportsmen. That you just can't behave that way. Um, I think John Fury's a glorified thug myself. I mean, he's done prison time for GPH, but I digress. Tyson Fury, he achieved big things in the ring, but he needs to show humility. And actually, Muhammad Ali had the same problem. He ran his mouth too much. Um, but even Ali showed a bit more humility when he lost. Tyson Fury doesn't. He still runs his mouth. He thinks he won, etc., etc. I mean, you see, I think it's okay to hype a fight, and you do need characters in the sport. Tyson Fury isn't going to be forgotten, that's for sure. He is a character, and I'll admit, at times he has been pretty entertaining. The whole Batman and Robin thing and all of that. He can be entertaining, but I also think Fury can cross a line sometimes. For example, riling up the crowd after the White fight, calling Usyk a little rabbit, and it just looks kind of crass and disrespectful and unsportsmanlike. To me, that was going beyond hype. It was just being a bit crass. Usyk showed one exemplary sportsman he is. He wasn't even rattled. It may have been that he just didn't understand um, Fury. Usyk, some Ukrainians have quite strong English. Usyk doesn't. He relies on a translator, so he may simply not have understood Fury, but he was really chill. He was just on his phone at the time. I'm so pleased that Usyk beat Fury the first time around, and frankly, the second time around, because I thought, okay, Fury, you've been beaten. Show some humility this time. Approach it differently. I mean, think of Rocky too, right? Apollo approached the second fight with Rocky a bit differently. Fury didn't do that. I mean, you might argue he was more serious, but was he? He was still running his mouth. So yeah, I mean, we'll have to be honest. Fury is one of our better heavyweights. Whether he ranks second or third will always be a matter of debate because unless we see Fury versus Joshua, we're never going to know. Lennox Lewis is our greatest heavyweight, but who's second? Is it Fury or Joshua? That will be an eternal question unless they fight. Um, After the fight, Fury held up that sword by the antique sword once held by Ivan Mazepa. Now, a little bit of history here, as explained by Alexander Krasjuk, Usyk's manager. Ivan Mazepa was a Hetman Cossack leader in the 17th century, a great symbol of Ukrainian resistance against, even then, against Russian imperialism. This sword apparently had been brought in to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, from the Chernihiv Historical Museum. It went through all the regulations, great care was taken. It's probably a priceless artifact. I can't think of any other boxing match in any division where something equivalent has happened, where you've had an antique historical item. I'm not talking about old belts or anything like that. Non-boxing item brought into the ring that way. It's incredible. Um, so, that to me isn't Usyk showing off. That's Usyk saying, I done this for Ukraine. It's not Usyk saying, look at me. It's Usyk saying, look at my country. Um, Ukrainian fighters are very patriotic, understandably so. Usyk comes in with really, really memorable Cossack outfits. It looks great aesthetically. Um, and yeah, I think it's going to be one of those things that's going to be remembered. Um, Now, where does Usyk rank in terms of, you know, heavyweight history? I may well make another video here on this one, but I'll just say that I think he is definitely secured his place in heavyweight history. Um, is it premature to put him in the top 10? Possibly, but he's definitely the best heavyweight of his generation. No question about that. I'd say, and this is not lacking any patriotism. I'm pleased that Joshua and Fury were at the top of the sport. But I do think Usyk is the greatest heavyweight since Vladimir Klitschko. Um, has to be said. I mean, you cannot ask any more of a fighter to go from cruiserweight and defeat every heavyweight. It's hard enough to go from cruiserweight, but to defeat everyone put in front of you, two of them twice. It's incredible. I mean, the only slight cloud might be that fight with Dubois, where there was a controversy over the low blow. I'll need to see it again. Um, I know Dubois tried to steal Usyk's thunder in this one. He gate crashed the interview, and he. I just hope Dubois doesn't go down the line of being another Tyson Fury. Because I like Dubois. He seems like a down to earth guy. He doesn't seem like the sort of loud fighter, loud obnoxious fighter. Um, but heavyweight boxing is heavyweight boxing. You call people out. So a second Dubois Usyk fight will definitely be in the works. Um, but you know what? Even if Dubois defeats Usyk in a rematch, that doesn't take away. It doesn't take away from what Usyk has done with Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. And in both cases, that's convincing. He defeated both of them twice. I mean, if it's, a first victory and then they come back and win in the rematch, you could say, oh, well, it's beginner's luck or it's a fluke or something like that. But you cannot say that with Usyk. That's what makes him so exceptional. I mean, there's been cases of heavyweights that have done great things, have had great upsets, and then they kind of went back to normal, so to speak. An example being James Douglas. He had one of the biggest upsets of all time in defeating Mike Tyson, and then after that, he was somewhat disappointing. He didn't do anything exceptional. I think he lost his next fight to Evander Holyfield, if I got that right. But it doesn't take away from what he done with Tyson. But in the case of Oleksandr Usyk, it's not just a one-hit wonder. This guy is an exceptional fighter. Um, the only thing is, he's 23 and 0. He's 37 years old. How long into his 40s will he go? Well, the sort of physical prowess of fighters today, the whole conditioning, everything is different. So it's reasonable to say fighters can fight longer. But let's just say George Foreman got the title at 46, Usyk 37. Now, let's look at that and say, okay, give him another 9 years to be optimistic. 9 years, he could achieve a lot. At some point, I think Usyk will be defeated. He is human after all. But what a fighter! What a fighter! I mean, he beat the best at cruiserweight: Maris Briedis, Tony Bellew, Murat Gaziev, Marco Huck, and he's beaten the best at heavyweight. And 23-0, you cannot ask more for a fighter than that. Where does he rank among the heavyweights? If I was putting him in the top 10, and I say this cautiously because I'm not sure that he's exactly a shoe in, although he's definitely, for me, he's a shoe in the top 20. And I would say he may have surpassed Evander Holyfield at this point because he's basically done what Holyfield done. And Holyfield had 10 losses, so I don't know. I guess we can only fairly judge when Usyk retires, but my top 10, very broadly speaking: Joe Lewis, Muhammad Ali, Gene Tooney, I put at number three. Tooney, I think, is hugely underrated. Exceptional heavyweight. I guess sometimes he's put in among light heavyweights. But yeah, I'm going to put Gene Tooney at number three. George Foreman. Vladimir Klitschko. Yeah, I've always held Klitschko in very high regard. Most dominant heavyweight of the 21st century. Lennox Lewis. Then after that, for me, it gets a bit tricky. Maybe Rocky Marciano. I used to put Marciano at number three. But the argument against Marciano would be the caliber of its opponents were either they were too old or they were mediocre. He can't help who he fought, but he did beat everyone. Marciano was a dirty fighter though, so no, not Evander Holyfield, Larry Holmes. Then honestly, I'd think about Usyk somewhere around between 8 and 10. If he's going to be in the top 10, I'd put him somewhere around there. But rounding off the top 20, Evander Holyfield, Jack Johnson, I think a bit like Mike Tyson. Both Mike Tyson and Jack Johnson, I suspect, are somewhat overrated. Tyson dominated for a period in the late 80s. But, guys who were not intimidated by him, that he always struggled against bigger guys. He always struggled against fights that went the distance. He lacked discipline. What Tyson had was speed and strength and an intimidating aura. And frankly, that was enough to be dominant for a few years. But beyond that, I do suspect Mike Tyson somewhat overrated. Um, and as for Jack Johnson, yes, he was a trailblazer. Yes, he had um, some guts to take on the white establishment at a time when black men were openly lynched. Um, he defied the vicious racism of the day. So he was incredibly brave in that sense. But as an actual fighter, I do think he's a bit overrated because if you look at the little archival footage that's available, and perhaps this could be said of all fighters of that era, their actual style was a bit wooden, a bit lumbersome. In fact, some fights, we often hear fights went on for hours and hours and hours, but what's often forgotten is those fights also lacked a lot of action. And they only went on for so long because there was a lot of grappling and basically wrestling. I mean, it's not necessarily that they were pummeling each other for 4 hours. Also, Johnson fought Jim Jeffries, who'd been retired for 6 years. That was his great, victory. So I do suspect Jack Johnson's somewhat overrated. There's other black fighters of that era, like Sam Langford, I suspect deserve perhaps more credit. Sam Langford was, a victim of the color bar. Jack Johnson was kind of the one black fighter who wasn't as adversely affected as others. Joe Jeanette was another great fighter of that era. Anyway, top 20: Joe Frazier, Vitaly Klitschko, Sonny Liston. They'd all fill in the names. But yeah, I'd put Usyk at this point probably above Evander Holyfield. And, Holyfield's a legend, but I just think Usyk has achieved so much in 23 fights. It's incredible. I'm not sure if Holyfield, I need to check the record. I don't think Holyfield achieved this at this point. Um, this is no disrespect to Vander Holyfield. He's a great fighter, but he did have 10 losses, and I'm not sure if he achieved it at this point in his career. He went up to, I'd need to check that. I might be wrong about that, but that's how roughly how I'd have my top 10. Um, yeah. So basically, I am downgrading Holyfield, Tyson, and Johnson. I'm upgrading people like Sam Langford, Alexander Usyk, um, and a few others. Ezra Charles too. Didn't mention Ezra Charles. He definitely should get more credit. And with that, I'll round this up. It's already longer than I intended. I may or may not make another boxing video about the state of the sport at this time. Um, I mentioned the Saudi dominance. Well, I'll just round this off because I don't know if I will make another video. People say the sport's dead. Really? 96,000 people at the Joshua versus Dubois fight? That doesn't sound to me like a sport that's dead. Now, it has been said, oh, ask someone on the street to name the world heavyweight champion, the unified world heavyweight champion. And I think it is fair to say most people won't know who Alexander Usyk is, except boxing fans like myself. But is that just because he has a Slavic name? You know, if his name was, I don't know, Mike Jones or Jack Smith, maybe people would know who he is. I suspect there is simply a bit of. I mean, I used to remember it annoyed me when American commentators in the early days they actually used to talk about the Klitschkos, about all these guys from Russia. I mean, Ukraine. They couldn't even get the location right, and they talk about Le Ukraine, which Ukrainians I understand find derogatory because it's the old Russian term for the country. So it's Ukraine, and you know, it's an older country actually than Russia. Even Rus was in establishment long before Moscow, so that's worth considering. Um, yeah, but I suspect, you know, for one thing, the world has a much bigger population than it did when Ali and Foreman were fighting. You know, it was about 4 billion people then. It's 8 billion now. There's other sports around. There's other distractions. I'm not. So I don't think this takes away from Alexander Usyk as the heavyweight champion of the world, and I don't think boxing's necessarily lost its appeal. I just think that the internet is so distracting. There's just so many things going on in today's world that weren't necessarily going on, for example, in the 70s. There weren't the distractions. So the world heavyweight champion would say, okay, it's Muhammad Ali or George Foreman or whoever it was at a particular time. Now, I suspect there's something in that. There's just so many distractions. That's how I explain it. But yeah, Alexander Usyk can hold his head high, and I hope they make a movie about him someday. I really do. Or the Klitschko's. I'd go to see it.